My name is Kaitlyn A. Kramer. I'm a second year MFA candidate here in the Art Criticism and Writing program. Our faculty respondent today is Dejan Lukic. Dejan's an anthropologist, a writer, and a teacher here in our department at SVA, whose current work revolves around the notions of charisma and ocularity. Before we begin the presentations, I want to spend a few words on the theme of this panel, which I have titled Mediating Space, and how these four relatively divergent topics are speaking to one another. Each paper independently demonstrates attentive and distinctive interpretations of this specific topic discussed. While they are at once dissimilar, I see in each a singularity concerning the presence and dependence on space, whether public or domestic, physical or virtual. Space can be understood generally as a force that demands interactivity, where our histories, culture, and politics converge and evert. We create and confound in and through space until the moment it becomes something else. This process is not always enacted as a domination of space, nor is it ever one-sided. Each space we inhabit counteracts our interventions, mediating our influence to retain identity. This is a congruence of coexistence at its best, at odds, a paradox. Our four panelists today offer perspective into the benefits and repercussions of our interactions with various spaces, and investigate how these relations can be depicted through works of art and technology. Our first presenter today is Nibija Chardi. She received her MA from the University of Washington Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. Her paper is titled, "This Is Where You Belong, Representations of the Ideal Woman in Pakistani Television Serials from the 1980s to the Present." Nabeeha.
So almost since the very beginning of television in Pakistan, Urdu drama serials have been immensely popular and widely watched. The ones I'm going to be looking at are from a time in the 1980s when Pakistan had one state-run television channel, to the 2000s when media was liberalized under the military regime of Pervez Musharraf. It was kind of like a sudden change from just one channel to like all these like 40, 50 channels. This was soon after 9/11, when to further his stated mission of enlightened moderation for Pakistan and to sustain his international liberal image, Musharraf set out to provide freedom to the media. I briefly discussed two popular plays from two distinct periods of Pakistani television, describing how a certain realism and complexity of characterization of women in earlier serials has made way for one-dimensional characters stereotyped along rigid dichotomies and understandings of these labels. Women in earlier serials were not stereotyped into neat categories. Many popular female leads were shown to have a function other than being good wives, and working women were often seen as the norm, rather than being constantly judged. Heroines were also seen in a wide variety of settings, as opposed to many present-day plays, where what audiences know about the female leads' lives is restricted mainly to the privacy of the home. In earlier plays, by observing women's interactions with others in both the privacy of the home and in the outside world, audiences were allowed a more in-depth look into their complex psychology relative to all spheres of their lives, whether it be love or career, marriage, friendship, family. The limited function and setting, along with the themes of present-day plays, seem to focus on the idea that good women belong in the private sphere, that is, at home. The major themes this project draws on include these serials' definitions of public-private spaces and the boundaries between them, the role of marriage and companionship, and the constant negotiation of tradition with the modern. I use two broad factors to explain the ways in which these themes are tackled. Firstly, state-media relations at the basic level of media censorship. And secondly, the intersection of state media relations with popular piety culture and broader aspects of mainstream politics. Though the differences between the serials are clear, explaining these differences is not very easy and does not lead to simple answers. For a broader understanding of how the dichotomy of Western versus traditional took root in the subcontinent and its central focus on women, Partha Chatterjee's discussion on women and nationalism is very useful. Chatterjee has explained how anti-colonial nationalism in India led to a division of social institutions into two distinct spheres, the material and the spiritual. As India accepted the superiority of the West in the material domain, it pushed even harder to preserve and maintain its superiority in the spiritual domain, which was marked by culture. The need to be modern but distinctly non-Western began the process of selective modernity. The nationalists hung on to the idea that the colonizers had failed to colonize the inner identity of the East, and women became a visible symbol of that identity, representing the sanctity of the private, unconquered sphere. Chatterjee's discussion is relevant and applicable to post-colonial Pakistan, where the good Pakistani woman is often seen as the polar opposite of the Western woman, who is shown to have little concern for the well-being of the home, indulges in useless luxuries, and is more interested in pursuing material skills to compete with men. In contrast, the good Pakistani woman devotes her life to her home and family, gets an education in order to be a better homemaker, and thus remains superior to the Western woman. To a large extent, this idea tends to play out in television serials, where the actual range of women's roles and participation in Pakistani society is not visible on the small screen, especially in entertainment media.
My talk is titled, Are You Still There? Tools of Interpersonal Negotiation. I will be looking into telepresence and mediated interactions and to articulate the evolving understanding of what it means to be present today and the ambiguity and identity of identity and involvement in such interactions. This is what I did my thesis on, and this investigation took place with the help of two research interventions and resulted in a proposal for future tools and services and manifestations of interactions that include presence and telepresence. So telepresence is essentially technology that allows you to be somewhere without actually being there. And it doesn't have to be let's get into that later. So that's what telepresence is, and I looked into the evolution of presence and what it used to mean versus what it means today. It is with new technology, especially things like wearable technology and Internet of Things, the scope of telepresence has vastly increased, and this includes from what it used to be more of like a practical use where you could virtually attend meetings. It has moved into include more intimate interactions, such as thumb kiss, which is like a feature for a couple's application where you can kiss each other through the phone screen, and just the translation of like what these intimate interactions mean in terms of like through mediated manifestations. Another change is another development is the fact that initially presence was limited either to a physical or a virtual space, and the protocols of interaction sort of also were defined by that factor. But now there's an increasing tendency of interactions to be a mesh of a digital and a physical, and that sort of leaves protocols of presence a little confusing. An example from South Park is a nightmare in FaceTime where Stan gets kidnapped by these killers and is virtually threatened by them scratching the iPad screen. Of course, that's not what it translates. Like, physical manifestation of a virtual presence is not equal to the physical presence as portrayed in this case. but it is a easy confusion to make. And the physical presence, like the iPad, it does have a lot of emotional association with the person being represented carried on. So I was looking into how this new understanding and acceptance of presence could be exploited for social interactions and what it means to delegate your socialness. So the concept of delegating being yourself the concept can't exist without an understanding of being a self in another. And when there is an other, you can assume that they could somehow act as a proxy of or a representation for you. And telepresence has the capacity to act as such a social surrogate due to the fact that it is essentially a representation through simulation or augmentation of a person. And services and surrogate acts so I looked into services and surrogate acts that sort of exist today, and there tends to be a perceived action and an actual action, and they try to circumvent some sort of a loophole. And for telepresence, the loophole tends to be interactions compensating for lack of physical presence. So from that, I deducted that these are sort of the qualities of a social surrogate act that exist. This includes things like the surrogate tends to be something that compensates for lack of inclination, someone that stands in as compensating for lack of capacity. They're either an augmentation or simulation, and so on. So some of the examples that currently exist include flat daddies, which is cardboard cutouts of military parents which are left for their kids, and the kids basically hang out with their proxy parent. And this is really interesting. So it's a static presence. It doesn't include incredibly high technology, but there's a whole community and a whole set of protocols that sort of have developed over time with it. For example, flat daddies aren't allowed into Disneyland. And another example is double robotics, which is this wheel with a screen essentially, and they've been promoting it as something you can like go to a museum through this thing and hang out with your friends. So it's spread out, like even the messaging has moved from something like go to an office via a screen to like perform all these social activities via such a interface. So mediated presence, so it has capacity to act as a proxy, and I was curious about what this means. Like, is this a possible service? What sort of proxies do people want? What sort of instructions would you give something like that? And what would be, how would such a system work? So this was one of the research interventions where I set up a speculative service called the Social Surrogacy Service. It ran over 3 weeks, and I conducted 10 events where people would come use my service and hire a proxy to act on their behalf in social situations. So you could hire a proxy, and then you had to choose an event, pick a proxy, and they browsed through proxy catalogs. So these sort of were developed based on current usage of current services that exist. So you could actors were hired, like for a human presence you could either have like an actor who would act on your behalf, or a friend or an acquaintance, or there's a screen presence which is like FaceTime and things like that, a static which sort of goes with flat daddies, trace presence which is more to do with like values, physiological or otherwise, it's crowdsourced presence, and a record presence which is an archive, but in retrospect it looks like your presence was there. This happened through a speculative application called a presence negotiator, which helps you define what the maybe is. So it was a calendar application, prototyped, and I worked with a couple of people who, mainly a lot of, who are the people who record everything? Okay, never mind. So they basically worked with like parameters of presence to define what sort of like how they wanted to define themselves, where it's either like live or, and a lot of people like did this where they would like split their presence into portions of their body and like build up scenarios where if you're going to a party, instead of all of you going there, you just send your crotch, so you know like what your, you know, the like you have premeditated, you have like a obvious premeditation to organizing how you are going to spend your time. And another aspect of this was compensation for absence, where if you say I'm going to be 40% present, there'd be a back and forth where people would be like, no, that's too little time, and then you're like, okay, I'll give you more time next week over coffee, or, and that sort of led to this development of a concluding committee where if nobody reaches, if there's like a negotiation that never ends, you have a concluding committee who's like, okay, you can leave that 40%, and things like that. So there were all these like other strange interactions that came out of it, and another one was to do with transition protocols. So since this was about how what presence means in this mesh of a digital and physical, this was also used as, say you're running late to something and you can send your like mouth and your eyes first and the rest of you follows, and means of transition which are so obvious in a digital space where you have like fade and fade out and things like that, and about how there's a potential to manifest it in a digital space, and about how that ties into face-to-face interactions.
Hello everyone. I guess I'll just get right into it. This photo's from 1980, but in the May of 1981, François Mitterrand, as head of the Parti Socialiste, defeated the incumbent Valéry Giscard d'Estaing to become the 20th president of France. Giscard, who had been elected in 1974 on an agenda of liberalism, had shifted in recent years from policies emphasizing liberalism in the social sense to the economic. Led by a number of national deregulatory measures, the city of Paris under his administration had been marked by an increased private development and middle-class shorting houses. In the fall of 1981, Jacques Rivette's film Le Pont du Nord straddles these two epochs, offering an encapsulation of the anxieties of the late Giscard era and an optimism towards a forthcoming sea change in France. This paper suggests that the corporeal navigation of the film's two protagonists through the space of Paris functions as an active narrative challenge to the city and a reimagining of the oppressive physical environment that they inhabit. Exploring the city first as it operates as a repressive space, I then adopt from Michel de Certeau the concept of subversive degenerate itineraries, which the protagonists employ in order to counter their antagonistic existence within the city of Paris. Le Pont du Nord opens with an extended shot of Black Leader, accompanied by the sounds of a helicopter in flight. While we'll shortly be immersed in the city itself, this sonic cue introduces the film's recurring theme of surveillance and tension between Paris as seen from above, often taking the form of maps, and experienced from below. This top-down perspective, until later reclaimed by the protagonist, is positioned as the flip side to their subversive itinerary. From here we're greeted with the curious and compelling intertitle, October and November 1980, already a long time ago. The dates refer to the time of the film's actual production, establishing the idea that objects, be they cities or celluloid, may have a seemingly fixed nature, but that they are constantly being rewritten and renegotiated. The plot of Le Pont du Nord is deceptively simple. Two characters meet by chance and spend 4 days together in the streets of Paris. We're introduced first to Baptiste, played by Pascale Augier. She appears in the film's first proper shot, a sophisticated pan that moves across the skyline, evocatively crowded with construction cranes, before allowing her figure to emerge, weaving through traffic on her motorcycle. Wordlessly coupled within Rivette's cinematic space, the connection between Baptiste and the shifting cityscape is introduced from the outset. She stops to survey her surroundings with a suspicious regard. She will only say later that she comes from elsewhere, but her foreignness is established by this silent, vigilant entrance. Before cruising off, she checks her compass, just one of the ways in which the heroines will orient themselves throughout the film. We're shortly introduced to Baptiste's future compatriot, Marie, played by Pascale's real-life mother, Boule Augier, whose entrance into the city in the back of a truck also doubles as her entrance into the film. These introductions are not unlike the extended shot from a moving train that opens Rivette's earlier Paris nous appartient, or Paris Belongs to Us, a film whose title might double as a rallying cry for Le Pont du Nord's protagonist, and their soon-to-be-realized Degenerate Itineraries. Writing on the earlier film, Mary M. Wiles notes how the scene positions the spectator to identify with the point of view of a tourist arriving from beyond the borders of the city, a refuge seeking the city as a safe haven, or a Parisian native returning home. One can't consider Le Pont du Nord without considering the idea of stories. As Desserteau establishes, spaces are all dominated and organized by existent narratives, whether they align with the itineraries of the spatial users or not. These stories, or treatments of space in Desserteau's terms, serve to activate space, turning them into meaningful places. While both characters might seem to appear out of nowhere, each arrives in Paris with their own history, or itinerary, which intersects with each other's as well as the historical narrative of the city proper. We learn eventually that Marie has just been released from prison for involvement in a Baader-Meinhof-style radical group, while Baptiste's past has been marked by Max, or Maxes, who she says are everywhere. Their gaze chases anything that moves. This sense of exposure and of constant visual domination is, as mentioned, an important concern for the film, and an impetus for the characters to establish their own independent movement through the space. Excuse me. Desserteau notes that the rational city, embodied in Paris of the Pont du Nord, is defined by the production of its own space, in espace propre. Rational organization must thus repress all the physical, mental, and political pollutions that would compromise it. Rather than be subsumed, the duo must refute their oppressive forces that surround them. There is a clear power play at work, one which Douglas Morey and Alison Smith outline as they write, echoing again the title of Rivette's earlier film, that if Paris, and whatever it hides, belong to us or does not belong to us, then we, filmmaker, protagonist, spectator, can make our own way through it, to lay bare its secrets, or submit to its direction and be drawn into its labyrinth. At times one might be tempted to feel that rather than Paris belonging to the characters, they belong to the city, which directs their movements, offers them refuge, and threatens them with indefinable danger. Here I may serve to say an additional word about Paris as a setting and a structuring force. For this we must first establish the city as it existed at the tail end of the Giscard administration. In the years immediately preceding Le Pont du Nord, the nation had seen a shift from the foundational 1976 anti-inflation Barre plan, introduced by Commissioner of Economic and Financial Affairs Raymond Barre. 1978 had seen a turn towards economic liberalism, supplanting the Barre's plan to impose tighter monetary controls, curbed wage demands, and capped higher salaries. Deregulation efforts saw cuts to new public housing initiatives along with a private property boom. Pressure from raised rents led to forced relocation for much of the middle class, something Rivette would surely have been aware of. This narrative development is of course linked to a narrative of domination. Just as the city had directed the flow and movements of its inhabitants, so too it attempts to control Baptiste and Marie. Desserteau writes how the language of power is in itself urbanizing, but the city is left prey to contradictory movements that counterbalance and combine themselves outside the reach of panoptic power, which ultimately take the form of these degenerate itineraries. Baptiste and Marie's deviations from the fixed environment and prescriptive map become prime examples of Desserteau's degenerate itineraries, a form of subversive narrative making. As he writes, "What the map cuts up, the story cuts across." Even though we can't consider their reclamation of space to exert an absolute agency, the two still allow an element of chance to function within the game. It's one that they sanction and participate in. Now might be an opportune moment to mention Rivette's Paris s'en va, a companion piece to Pont du Nord that was released in anticipation of it in January of '81. The 30-minute work is constructed out of footage from the film itself as well as outtakes. Both abstract and circular, the film is more deeply concerned with the game of the goose, even structured and edited as if obeying the game's rules of chance. Released 6 months before the feature, it could also be described as a sketch, a first path cutting through the material. Rivette himself has a history of these prototypes. More than an alternate cut, he reassembles the pieces of the film into a unique entity. Something he did with his film Out One in the 70s. In 1991, Les Belles Noises was recut to another film called Divertimento. One calls to mind Desserteau's idea of bricolier, a term he generally uses for the forging of stories in space, but we also see the way it describes Rivette's efforts to develop discrete narratives built out of the same material. Writing on bodies in the city with words that also effectively describe the game of the goose, Elizabeth Groves notes that it is a question of negotiation of urban spaces by individuals or groups more or less densely packed, who inhabit or traverse them. Each environment or context contains its own powers, perils, dangers, and advantages.
On April 25, 1967, the Turcotte interchange was open to automotive circulation. Its construction lasted just over a year. 3 days later, Montreal was celebrating the opening of the 1967 International and Universal Exposition, colloquially known as Expo 67. The infrastructure was built in the heyday of social modernity following Révolution Tranquille and is part of Quebec architectural modernism centered around Expo. The now crumbling infrastructural network, designated as the Turcotte Complex, comprises 3 highway exchanges along Échangeur Turcot. This last one connects the east-west axis of Autoroute 20 with the north-south axis of Autoroute 15 and with the underground Ville-Marie expressway that extends under downtown Montreal, or Autoroute 720. The junction with Autoroute 720 was the last part of Turcotte interchange to be erected. The underground expressway opened in '72 and its easternmost sections were completed in '75. It is estimated that 6,000 people were expropriated and relocated with minimal compensation by the Ministry of Transport of Quebec, or MTQ. A proposal to replace the old interchange is designed in 2009 and slightly revised in 2012 by the MTQ. In a way, the proposal put forward looks like a replay of the modernist tabula rasa. The original structure will be raised and replaced by a completely new one built lower on artificial embankments. Around 400 residents will be evicted from Saint-Rémy and Cazelet streets, portions of which are slated for demolition. These reflection proposals, above and beyond their effects on local populations, impact on ecological systems, and lack of creative design, despite inflated costs, fail to recognize the role major infrastructures play in the urban fabric. That is, as opposed to the original modernist construction, which, despite its questionable vision and its many ties to corrupted politics, was certainly conceived as a visually striking symbol, a technological feat and a tool in the strategic deployment of a new way of life. The reflection plan that will be implemented, which is in reality more of a demolition and reconstruction plan, has been drained of any formal or social structural ambition. The new interchange is aimed at maintaining a status quo of ever-increasing automotive traffic. Can greed and corruption congeal into an ideology, even a satisficing one? What kind of symbol can a 3D rendering with trees growing under viaducts, which looks like the hybridization of a mini golf and a landscaping arrangement in the parking lot of a suburban mall be? Architecture theorists Sanford Quiner and Daniela Fabricius depict the city as a perpetually organizing field of forces in movement, each city a specific and unique combination of historical modalities in dynamic composition. Infrastructures, they insist, perhaps more than anything else, constitute the historical element in cities. They are preeminently their engines of change. They continue, the city today, to a greater degree than ever before, actually is those data sets and is those networks of public equipment through which the data circulates. Our rapidly disarticulating city is increasingly reconstituting itself in vitro as a dynamic archive, where the later term is understood as a massive depository of local and global knowledge that, in the manner of any natural ecology, provide a maximally flexible, satisficing, suffice plus satisfy, infrastructure for life. From here, I want to come back to the context surrounding the construction of the Turcotte. I want to frame it with 3 moments. One, Expo 67, which immediately follows the interchange opening. 2, SECO and Public Inquiry and Clich Royal Commission, which together span the years 72 to 75, look into the ties between organized crime, construction unions, and political financing, and which corresponds to the end of the construction project. And 3, the October crisis, which happens in the midst of it all in 1970. The World Fair, Expo 67, came to be celebrated as emblematic of avant-gardist theories of the megastructure, a symbol of the optimism of large-scale thinking of the 60s. The megastructure was broadly imagined to be a flexible framework that enclosed the function of a city, thereby making imminent new forms of human interaction, social control, and the technical organization of space. Central to the heroic articulation of the megastructures were the techniques of long-span structures inside or under which would be housed a new mass public. The most perspicacious and polemical architects and critics did not, however, see the megastructures of Expo 67 in isolation. Rather, they read these architectures against the backdrop of what had already been labeled as Montreal's multi-level city, where a new core of subterranean links between skyscrapers and public infrastructures was described as a network and an organism.
So we're going to take the next 30 minutes or so to ask some questions. I think we will speak among the panel first, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask any questions. Dan, do you have any questions to start?
Sure, no problem. I have a question for each of you individually, but maybe I'll start by asking more general for all of you. As I was listening to you and reading a little bit, I had to come up perhaps with, not had to, but it emerged, it became apparent that there's a line, obviously, this is why Kaitlyn brought you together, that runs through all of these diverse and beautiful papers of yours. And the line that I see is that space, it's kind of obvious, of course, and I'm sure it's very obvious to you, space is not neutral or innocent. All space is controlled space, which is kind of depressing, but you guys managed to make these things interesting. That being a fact, first of all, I think it's a fact, and I would like to hear if you agree. From your examples, it seems a very accurate fact to me. And the second thing is that since this is either digital interface spatiality or the actual physical space of the city, equally they're controlled spaces through different techniques. And since that's the case, how does one deal with it? And it seems that one deals with it by negotiating movement and presence. And I think in all of your papers, it's about, this is the examples that you discuss is basically negotiations of movement and presence, perhaps as the only way to deal with mediated space. So that's my general comment that ties all of your papers. Is there a space that's not mediated? And secondly, what's the importance of negotiating one's movement or presence? Go ahead.
Thank you. Just maybe on the idea of it being depressing, I'm sure you're not totally depressed, but actually I think that realizing that is the good part of it. Like we were discussing yesterday, we were referring to Zizek saying who's taken from somebody else, and who says like there's two types of people. There are, I don't know who I was talking about that with, maybe they're in the other room. There's complete idiots and people who are not complete idiots. So I think that, realizing that you're being controlled, that space is mediated, like that's already, like, it makes me feel good. Like, okay, at least I'm not totally lost. Like I can negotiate. I'm a little bit aware. I'm not totally free, but I have like some push and pull kind of things happening in there. Yeah, so that would be my first remark.
That plays in really interestingly with what's ignored, because they have there's this somewhat depressing existence of the surveillance and the oppression that's happening within the cityscape, and sort of the interactions between different political parties and how the characters exist in it. But they take the actual city as a map and dissect it into a game, which allows for this sort of satirical and maybe pernicious play within oppression or surveillance. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is no such thing as a neutral space, and that it's constantly being negotiated. I think you kind of have to take the fact that all space has these powers at play and work that you have to use this negotiation. But I think there's a nice dynamic between the sort of visibility in both the film and any other case, in kind of you're in the city, where it's like, there's the potential for oppression, but it's also assertive. You're visible and you're there, and you're constantly like negotiating and making your own way in the city, in any sort of space. which I think is nice that there's this potential. It can be translated also into the digital realm with image making practices as well.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, and I feel like there's always going to be some sort of awareness about it, but at one time, like there's going to be, like you said, like there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are not aware of it and a whole bunch of people who are, and I don't think that's ever going to change. At one given time, there's always going to be that thing. So there's that frustration of, so it's good that you realize it, but then there's that frustration of how do you deal with it, and then that frustration of how do you make other people understand that. But so, yeah.
Well, it seems it's a matter of developing techniques, and you know what you guys have brought up are exactly very specific techniques. You're discussing the strategy or Rivette's method of dealing with this problem, very precise, using a game, a strategic game to negotiate and augment, as you say, that problem. You have a concept, I think, critical, commemoration, which is also an interesting strategy, because commemoration, I assume, is monumentalization as well.
Yes. Again, could be very problematic. Like
right,
right from the start. Like it's like how do you do something that works with memory, but that's not totally authoritarian and oppressive and top down. So it's like I guess like critical doesn't really describe like the actual strategies that are in play, but it's just like I think it works as a shield because it happens like discussing this project when you just say like you start talking about commemoration and people go like ah! But I wanted to say I think like the order that we went into is very interesting, and I'm not sure that you with the two terms of
it was all planned.
The two terms, like a physical space and virtual space, or I don't remember what's the exact phrasing you use. And I'm sure you don't mean them as like binary terms, and like you certainly see a gradation. I think it's always been the case, but I think that it's becoming very obvious with like, for instance, your paper, or that more and more like there's not going to be any difference, and like one of the contemporary stake, I guess, is to kind of work around this kind of intermeshing of, and there's never was this distinction actually between.
I think it's depressing if you're like on the receiving end where all that structure is already set and you sort of have to follow the rules in it. But it's more exciting when you can like you are the one who are creating these frames in the first place. And I think like a scope for it with the digital and physical and things like that, where I know a lot of it, like things exist, but then you can there's always room for like creating new frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, especially your example and your own project of developing surrogacy agency, or what was it?
Yeah, social surrogacy.
It sounds like a dream. Who wouldn't want a surrogate to go to work or boring meetings? I think it's a phenomenal idea. But there's and you know, your presentation was most affirmative of the potentials of fusing digital with physical. But there's still a problem. I wonder what you think of, or it's just my dream and getting old, of lived immediate experience. Does it still make sense to even speak about that? Does it make sense to valorize and you know, be nostalgically attached to the actual lived experience? This was a huge critique since the 60s. You guys probably know. It's from Guy Debord, psychogeography, that we live in the society of the spectacle, where everything is representation. We don't have any more lived experience. So, you know, situationists and Marxists cried about it. And it's still true. It's not like it's changed But there is the fusion is perhaps stronger than ever. So my question is, listening to you, is it still a valid question that we need lived experience, or is lived experience now part of the interface?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, just because you have, for example, I mean, I know there's all that criticism about how people spend all that time online and they don't have, and introduces face-to-face interactions, but there's a study which shows that the people who are more active online tend to also be more active in person, and it's not like a mutually exclusive thing. Just because you're active online doesn't mean you don't interact with people on a daily basis. So it's not an either or.
Yeah,
Basically.
that's good.
Awesome.
Do you guys have any questions for each other, or should we?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a proper way to phrase it, but it kind of taps into this. It was for Divya as well. And it's like, when I was watching the presentation, I couldn't help but thinking about like live streaming. Like, it was only like a week ago that I was at home on my computer watching these people on the streets in Ferguson with like live streaming and this sort of surrogate potential, which is interesting because you think of moving images trying to tap into activism, and it's like, it doesn't always work because it lacks this immediacy, but with live stream, it's there. And there's a surrogacy, and there's even an exchange because you can chat with the people who are there and be like, go to this street corner because there's something happening there. I'm not quite sure the question I want to ask, but I'm curious to see what you think about something like
No,
that.
I think it's really interesting because there's so many things that exist now which follow those lines, but there are no rules around it because it's so new. It's like, oh, this technology exists and how can we use it? And it hasn't yet, I don't think it's moved to a point where it's an established thing. And because it just seems so new, like there's a thing called drone journalism, which is amazing. But the fact that you can have, like, it's plugging into all these pre-existing professions and stuff, like functions. I don't know. I think it's, I don't know what about it, but it is a thing which is more and more prevalent, and I think it's interesting to see what would happen, like what that means. In terms of, I don't think it really is, it hasn't fleshed out yet because it feels like it's relatively new, but it's, I think this potential to actually design it somehow.
It's a very active intervention in the space in a way.
Yeah,
I think is really
like,
nice.
yeah, I mean, and that's a good thing. I think.
Yeah.
It's not a good, it just depends on how you use it, this potential to be good or bad. But
So you feel like it might get, like, as it gets more and more not new, it's gonna be more structured, more rules, more kind of stuff.
I guess so, like that's
Yeah.
seems to be the progression of how people deal with things like this.
Yeah, but then hopefully there'll be something newer to take, take its place.
But one of the part of the longer paper that I kind of cut with, in the presentation towards the end, when I bring examples of like past projects that could be similar to what I'm doing, or I bring up there was a project in the 70s called Metro Education that was never built in Montreal, but that was trying to like in before the creation of UQAM, which is this university downtown, which is linked to the subway and all that. People knew they were coming, and two architects proposed to use like existing office space and the corridors. Like obviously the underground city now it's just a mall and the subway system, but there was that at first like people wanted to investigate it and invest it in the end of using like existing space, and then you build temporal structures, and then you end up building permanent structures to link all that, and the mega structures, or even in Banham's review of many expo pavilions, like there's this constant concern, and but also recognition of how close like criticality and spectacle are, and like there's just constant flipping. Like all those architects who propose things, like they always end up like, are we really creating like an open space, or are we just creating the image? Like are we stimulating, or are we simulating? And Banham says that in like one of his favorite pavilion is Man the Producer Pavilion, because he says like there's places of displays like screens, but there's also these spaces of circulation where you kind of stop seeing images, and all you see is like other spectators moving in this space and this like weird mega structure environment, and he brings up like the bar and all that. And it's I heard recently somebody discussing like the spaces of recognition versus spaces of, I don't know what the other term was, but like I said, we could say breaks or shifts, and I think these things kind of constantly flip, like, and I think of even like something like this idea of téléprésence, you know, it's not like one or the other, it's always this shift at the end of a like sliding door almost all the time.
Yeah.
So unfortunately we're running out of time, but if you guys don't have any more questions for each other, I guess we can open it up to like one question from the audience if anyone has a question. It's like a lot of pressure. But
Better be good. No, I'm just kidding.
you, the tall one.
I'm wondering about the idea of how an implementation of surrogacy, especially in social situations, will change our accountability of our actions. And an example that I'm thinking of where there is a negative effect of it is in the US military, where they've started having their technicians, basically, they no longer have to be in front of the person that they're killing. They're getting further and further removed from the things that they're affecting in the world. And I'm wondering if we have these surrogates where we're getting further and further removed from the effects of our actions, if we will no longer feel responsible to actually act in the way that we would if we were there in person.
That's obviously a bad thing, but what I was trying to get at is like these things already exist, and the fact that like that used to be a very digital quality, like that's why internet has so much porn, because that the accountability sort of, it's easier to do bad stuff when you're anonymous, right? And it is a quality which is very specific to internet or like the digital space, and that is like permeating into the physical. And so I was trying to look at like when that happens, there are no rules right now because you don't follow the rules of the digital or the physical, and like it's sort of the scope for things to go wrong. I mean, yeah, so there are no rules as such when that shift happens, right? So I guess my point was like, so the scope to actually like build something there, because it doesn't exist right now, where it's just like a lot of trial and error to see what sort of interactions work and what don't.
And then it just comes down to
finding
the right person to create the rules and hoping that the rules are
something like that.
When you said responsibility, but it also brings the idea of accountability. Like, in terms of like drone pilots, like, oh, it's not my fault. Like, I was not there. I couldn't really see what was happening. Like, does that become an argument? Like, I didn't do it. Like, it's my clone did it. Like,
but they get traumatized. Like, I think there's some.
Oh, the drone fighters get traumatized, or poor guys.
Because they feel really bad. No, I mean, I don't think you can blame them, because I think it's orders at the end of it. But still, I mean, there's no bad guy as such. I mean, there's just like loads of things that can go wrong, but I don't think you could like blame the pilot in particular to be like, why did you go? Because the orders probably come from somewhere else, right? But they do get a little traumatized, and there's like this strange sense of like, okay, there is no accountability, but at the same time there is like this emotion involved with proxy. Like, it depends on the person how accountable they hold themselves. Does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense.
Well, we can continue this conversation over bagels and coffee in the lounge, but thank you all so much for coming, and all of these amazing papers will be available on our website, so you can read further into their projects.